Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. I'm Deborah Davidson, director and founder of Catalyst Conversations, and I am so pleased to welcome you to a Catalyst Conversation here at MACOM. It has been a pleasure working with Lori Damon, someplace over there, and I want to thank her and Megan Healy for together orchestrating our being here today. Catalyst Conversations was founded in 2012 to open a critical path for dialogue between the arts and sciences. We present intimate and provocative conversations between artists, scientists, and the public, and we're interested in connecting the two through programs, educational outreach, and events like this, which demonstrate the conversation and synergy between art, science, and technology. And this afternoon, we're going to hear from media artist Brian Knepp and architect Andrew Witt about the idea of how something is created from nothing. How are artists and scientists similar in the ways they approach problems? How do they find ways of connecting to the world, and how do they differ? Brian Knepp and Andrew Witt will explore these questions apropos of their own projects and how they use their respective knowledge and interest in art, science, and technology. Both artists and scientists push boundaries of how to see the world, and they pursue new ways to view objects and the possibilities presented by doing so. For artists and scientists from all fields, the process of creating something from nothing is making something visible which is not, and in being able to deal with failure. These are aspects they all share. I think this also demonstrates the ability to think creatively. I think that relationship to failure and trying again and again, probably most of you experience that in some way in the work you do here. The one big difference is that both science and art need metaphor to find something new, but at some point science needs to go beyond metaphor. And I think this is a terrific investigation of visualizing what is not yet visible by way of a fascinating conversation this afternoon. Brian Knepp is a media artist who works range from large-scale interactive installations to microscopic sculptures for nematodes. He was the first artist in residence at Harvard Medical School, working side by side with scientists using their tools and techniques to explore alternative means and ways of connecting to the world. Knepp's piece, Deep Wounds, was commissioned by the Office of the Arts at Harvard University and has won awards for Ars Electronica in the International Association for Art Critics and American for the Arts. Early in his career, he worked as senior software engineer at Industrial Light and Magic, and he worked on movies such as Jurassic Park, Mission Impossible, and Star Trek Generations. While there, he developed tools, including two for which he and 3 others were awarded Technical Academy Awards. Knepp also helped find Nearlife, a high-end design and technology company creating interactive experiences for science and children's museums. Andrew Witt is co-founder with Tobias Nolte of Certain Measures, which is a Boston-Berlin design and technology incubator that combines imagination and evidence for systemic and scalable approaches to spatial problems. Their clients include Audi, BMW, Futurium, which is the German Federal Museum of the Future, and the Dubai Future Foundation. The work of Certain Measures is in the permanent collection of the Centre Pompidou and has been featured at the 2018 show Coding the World There. Witt is an assistant professor in practice in architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, teaching and researching in the relationship of geometry and machines to perception, design, assembly, and culture. Trained as both an architect and mathematician, he has a particular interest in the technically synthetic and logically rigorous approach to form. He was previously director of research at Gary Technologies, where he solved complex geometric challenges for clients, including Gary Partners. So each of our speakers will present for about 10 minutes, and then we'll gather with me as moderator for a conversation, and we hope that sooner than later, especially since we're in this lovely, intimate room, for you to partake in the questions as well. So with that, Brian.
Hey everyone, thanks for having us. How many people in the room are engineers or have an engineering background? All right, great. So I have an engineering background as well. This is my this hello slide, saying hello everybody. This is a piece called Big Smile. If we have time, I'll show you about it. But so as you heard, I have an engineering background as well. I did a lot of stuff. I worked in special effects. I worked in exhibit design, and now basically mostly a fine artist. And a lot of my work, I was very interested in emergent behavior, things like these. Fortunately, the video is a bit choppy, but these are starlings. You might have seen these on YouTube, really beautiful flocking behavior where they kind of look like one organism. So what fascinated me from early days was the idea that this is made up of thousands of these guys, following simple rules, and the kind of complexity you can get out of simplicity. And similarly, you have, that's happening sort of over time. These shapes are occurring over time. These flocks are avoiding predators and going towards food and stuff. But also you have things, emergent patterns like zebra stripes. So when you have something like this, or a lot of natural patterns, there's no, the mother isn't painting these on. It's basically based on the interaction of lots of chemicals that are diffusing over the surface of an embryo as it's growing and also reacting with each other. Some of you might have heard of reaction diffusion. Has anyone heard of that? It's a type of mathematical system that basically creates these types of patterns. And again, as an artist, what I do is I look at things like that and I think of them, what are the metaphors in there? What strikes me? And in this case, there was a lot about wounding and healing and how these patterns grow. So I created a number of pieces called Healing. It's the internet connection to the video. Yeah, sorry, something about the connection is not really working very well. All right, I'll tell you more about it. So basically these patterns that are running are, I'm sort of simulating some of these natural patterns that occur in nature using these reaction diffusion equations. I'll show them to you later because you guys might be interested. And all they're trying to do is basically grow in the simulation space to fill the whole thing up. As you walk across, you wound them, you basically change them in the area that you're walking, and then they try to regrow in that area. And through that, you can explore a lot of ideas about interaction and how we react to change. Then a lot of these is probably the largest one I've made. These are two different variations on it. Each one wounds and heals in a slightly different way. These are the equations. They're just two partial differential equations. I'm sure you guys are interested in this, but here's your diffusion, here's your reaction. It's basically a connected system of equations that if you pick the right sort of variables, they stabilize into really beautiful patterns. This one is called Fitsu-Nagumo, if you're interested. It was first used to describe basically electrical impulses along neurons. But for some reason, if you take this and you simulate it in 2 dimensions, you get these beautiful patterns. And these kinds of things have been used to try to describe zebra stripes, rock striations, cheetah spots, a lot of different kinds of generative type patterns in the world. What's interesting about them is that you can vary them a little bit and get quite different results. And so I started playing with this a little bit and trying to see what could happen. So this is a series of pieces called Drift. Each one of these is simulating a slightly different variation of that pattern. The blobs basically drift from one side to the other, and as they cross the membrane between 2 different panels, they take on the characteristics of the new panel. And they go out of this side of the panel, they come back in, so it's a closed loop, it's a torus. What's fascinating about it is it will essentially never repeat. So this is a piece that has no interactivity, no input. You just set it running, but it will never be the same twice. I mean, it will eventually, but probably millions of years. So I started to think a little bit about, I started out as an interactive artist. A lot of my work really reacts to people, to what you're doing in the world. So I started to think about how to give that piece an awareness of the world. When I think about my work, it tends to be in terms of not how can I entertain people or get them involved, but more if my piece has some kind of awareness or perception, what would it do with that? So in this case, the piece, there's some embedded cameras that are hidden. They're scanning the environment 60 times a second. Whenever they see faces, like a human face, they assume someone's looking at it. They try to determine where that face is looking, and the column they're looking at will actually stop moving. So this is like that last piece, but instead of blobs drifting from left to right, they drift from bottom to top. And if you're looking at a particular column, that column stops moving. And because these are generated systems, these aren't videos, that column will be forever different from the rest of the columns. So this piece, like the other pieces, the state of it is dependent upon who looked at it from the moment it was turned on. Those other pieces are similar. I forgot to mention that, but these pieces over here, they start out a particular way, and the way they are at any given moment is dependent upon who walked across them from the moment they were started. So they have a history. So this idea of history is kind of important to me as well. Just to give you a sense of the timing, they're very, very slow pieces, very meditative. So if you were walking by this very quickly, you may not even notice it's moving. If you spend a bit of time with it, you'd notice it was moving, but you might not notice it's reacting to you. And if you really spend some time with it, then you would notice it's reacting with you. So there's sort of like deeper levels. And for me, that's totally fine. Like if you don't see all those levels, it's okay. It's really more about the piece and its perception. So you can see they're all different now because people have looked at different columns over the time. So those were kind of earlier pieces, and then a couple years ago, actually, Deborah asked me to be in a piece with my wife, who's also an artist, and we decided to create embryos. She did something very organic, and I went back to that kind of simulation of patterns, but in 3 dimensions now. So these are basically starting with a vat of chemicals, synthetic chemicals, virtual chemicals, seeding with a 2-cell embryo and just letting it grow, and whatever came out had to sort of, that existed. I created 40,000 different ones. You can tell some of them just did nothing, some of them exploded, and then I printed out a bunch of those in 3D ceramics. 3D printed them. Many of them were unprintable because of the way they stabilize. They formed these kind of very beautiful surfaces, quite nice to hold. They feel like the weight of a newborn baby. It's kind of what I was going for. Many of them split. So these actually are twins, so if I push them together, they kind of lock in. So wherever there's a protuberance here, there's an indentation there. Some of them didn't split. And then, so I'm going very quickly through my work because we don't have a lot of time, but we can talk about this later. So I was an artist in residence for a while at Harvard Medical School, did a lot of work with scientists, got very interested in what they were doing with their model organisms. So many of you probably know that a lot of scientists like to study the same organisms so they can compare notes and build on each other's work. This is Xenopus tropicalis, which is a model organism used because its eggs are quite large and transparent, of course, so you can see development. They're used to study development. They're very cute, of course. The medical school was very nice to me. They gave me my own lab, actually. The picture here. And I tried to use the same techniques. So I had some frogs. I cultivated them. I worked with them. They gave me a lab coat. And it was, a lot of this work was a bit tongue-in-cheek. Like, obviously, I'm not a scientist, but I studied these frogs for quite a while. I got really interested in this idea of metamorphosis. You can probably tell that from my other work. This is a frog going from a tadpole to a frog. Amazing. They suck in their tails. They grow these feet. They become air breathers from gill breathers. So I took a lot of photos of them, did a lot of works. This is a piece called Frog Time. That was kind of the culmination of it. So this is a frog basically kicking from youth to adulthood and shrinking back into youth. He's striving all the time against this oppressive idea of time, moving time. Striving. There's this spotlight following him and never quite catches up with him. This piece, and like those other pieces, it's a generative work. Now, you might never notice it with this, but to me it was important conceptually that there's, in the computer program, there is this, kill it again. Anyway, there's this, like an actor of a frog. He has an energy level that varies over time. The more energy you have, the faster he swims. Time is an actor that's constantly moving. There's a spotlight trying to catch him. So the piece, again, will never repeat. Now, will anyone know that in the gallery? Probably not, but to me it was kind of conceptually important. This goes on forever. The idea behind the spotlight is that this is happening everywhere as well. You see, there's a lot of work I did later, I might get a chance to show you, where there's this idea that things are happening everywhere, and when I project stuff onto walls, I'm not projecting the image onto the wall, I'm projecting kind of an X-ray to show what's already there. Conceptually, I mean, I'm not a lunatic, but... So I did a number of these. One of the things we might talk about, the way my process works, is I tend to spend a lot of time on tech or science. Like these frog pieces probably took me 6 months to just get the data, and then I'll make a lot of works out of that data. And, it kind of creates a very rich soil for me. So there's another piece where this is another piece. I was on Boston Harbor Islands Pavilion exploring natural versus unnatural. Then I moved on to work with nematodes. These are Caenorhabditis elegans. Have anyone heard of that? You might have heard it if you read Science Times and stuff in the New York Times. This is about 1 millimeter from here to here. They are the probably most studied multicellular organism in the world. They're really cool. They have 200 neurons. They have a little brain system. They've got a gut. They have eggs. Most of them are hermaphrodites, so they self-fertilize. They have sperm as well. And they're also mostly transparent, so we can see these organisms. And I was working with scientists who were trying to understand aging, and I was trying to understand, is there a way to connect to these? How am I doing?
2 minutes.
All right. I started to poke a little bit of fun at the scientific method and trying to think about how to connect to these organisms in a way. Is there a way to do that? A lot of this work is very tongue-in-cheek. So this is a piece called Avatar. Some of you might know Avatar means the kind of manifestation of a god in our world. So this is, I took a picture of a worm, and then I printed it as a microscopic sculpture, and I put it back in with the worm. So this is me. This is my avatar inside with the worm. And this went on, and I started to do a lot of different experiments on how to connect with them. This is the worms living in detritus from my body. So as many of you know, we're covered in bacteria and fungi and arachni, and it's actually part of our biome. So I cultured that, and they're growing in that. People here must recognize this. Anybody here recognize this? No, wow. Yes, thank you. So Carl Sagan and his wife developed these, and they were etched on a gold plate from the side of the Voyager, sent out beyond the solar system. The idea was if some aliens come across them, they'll know about us, but really it's kind of like us saying this is us, like going to the top of a mountain and yelling your name. And so similarly, I shrunk them down to worm size, and you can see the worms are exploring them. So this came more about like a scientist would look at this and say the worms are just exploring, trying to have sex, trying to eat. But my point is more that there's an emotional connection we can have to this that's still relevant on the level of metaphor. Here's some more constructions I did. I started doing tests. I am still very interested in meditation, so I started doing meditative walks for them to see if they were interested in meditation. This was actually based on a paper where they were trying to see if they could learn. So they were putting them into mazes. Mazes are, of course, paths where you have choices. A labyrinth, many people don't know, is a path with no choices. It's really just about the walk. You'll find it sometimes in, of course, there's a big Buddhist practice around it, but also churches. There's a famous one in Nantes, and I pronounce it in France. It's embedded in the floor, and it's been sort of recapitulated as a walk to Jerusalem. It's a meditative type thing. So I was interested in whether the worms are interested in that. And again, just so you know, this is tongue-in-cheek for me. I don't actually think the worms care, but it's more about how we perceive that. video showing. So these, I call them microscopic sculptures, but there really were more environments for the worms to explore.
So Brian, I think that's a good
Good.
If
good
you don't
starting
mind.
point. No.
place to end.
All right, there you go. That was quick, but
Yeah. So,
thank you.
each of the speakers could easily do 2 hours, but this is a different kind of thing. So, Andrew.
So I wanted to think a little bit about this idea of something from nothing, or where this process of creativity happens. And in particular, maybe think about not necessarily something from absolutely nothing, but something from the sort of like scraps and remains of things that, that came before. So my sort of like office and creative practice have been doing some research around this process of kind of extreme reuse or extreme recycling, which I'd like to sort of share as a way to think about this theme. Yeah, obviously all of these projects are collaborative efforts, so there are a lot of other people involved, and so it's just give a shout out to all of them. Now, so our office essentially is about a third of what we do is related to sort of like maybe culture, art, institutional kinds of projects. About a third is sort of architecture proper. About a third is what we might call strategic consulting, so working with big clients around various kinds of difficult spatial problems. And we develop software and tools for all of those kinds of engagements, and often they sort of cross-fertilize each other in very interesting ways. One of the sort of domains of sort of technical domains that we've been working a lot with lately is what we call spatial recognition. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking computer vision tools from the facial recognition world and applying them to problems which are a little bit more relevant at the architectural scale. So when you begin to work with machine vision, you immediately come to sort of perceptual problems that are very relevant also to the way that we perceive things as humans. And in particular, there's kind of this set of objects that you might, or not objects really, but kind of drawings that are often called impossible objects. And these impossible objects are these kinds of drawings, which they have a little bit this Escher-like quality. You're not quite sure if it's only a drawing or if it's implying something spatial or sort of volumetric. And if it is, what is that object? They're very ambiguous forms, and they've been used in psychology to evaluate various kinds of neurological conditions, but they're also actually today used in a machine vision context to understand how well computers can basically disentangle those objects and speculate on how well the computer can sort of like understand space, basically. So we were interested in those also sort of in conjunction with some other kinds of perceptual experiments that are intended to camouflage. Some of you might be familiar with this, these kinds of images. So these are so-called dazzle painting from World War II, which was intended to sort of camouflage very large vessels by virtue of this sort of print, which suggests something which is kind of spatial, but also kind of graphic. So we were interested in this sort of convergence of those two ideas as it pertained to architecture. So architecture and space. So those kinds of drawings suggest certain kinds of objects, but constructing those kinds of objects is kind of difficult because you have to create this object that from a certain perspective very ambiguously suggests maybe multiple things. And so what we began to do was to take these certain kinds of line drawings. On the left is a drawing by an artist, Joseph Albers, who did a lot of work with this kind of stuff, and on the right is a sort of sculptural piece that we did that had those sort of projective qualities. We were interested in building those kinds of ambiguous shapes at full scale. One of the things that happens is that when you have these ambiguous sorts of shapes, the only way you can make an object like this in space is by creating surfaces which are highly warped, and which essentially join these lines in a way which is a little bit maybe counterintuitive, but I should turn that off. A little bit counterintuitive, but actually, a little bit counterintuitive, but very legible from a certain perspective. So we began to construct these kinds of forms. And so if you were to look at this from the top down, you would see this sort of knot structure, which is very similar to those impossible objects. But then as you move it around, it begins to become this more intricate kind of spatial structure. So to build these things, we had to develop I don't know, for me, sophisticated methods of actually constructing complex surfaces. So each of these, although they look triangulated, are actually these sort of like long strips which have been stitched together to create this kind of structure. So this structure maybe has 20 of those strips, which have then been assembled to create this more intricate perceptual form. This animation, same issue here a little bit with the video, but this animation shows a little bit that process where we begin with this sort of impossible object, and then using the properties of the material itself. So if you think of a long metal strip, that metal strip can only twist in certain ways. We take all of the properties of that metal strip and then embed those properties in the structure of the form, itself. So this quilting pattern is actually something that emerges from the properties of the underlying geometry. So with that kind of logic, we've developed a series of sort of larger structures, some of them pretty large, which play on this question of how an object can be perceived sort of two-dimensionally and three-dimensionally, and what the space in between those 2 and 3 dimensions might be in terms of our apprehension of what an object is. So there's this very interesting sort of intersection of how we see things, how something is constructed, and how very complex forms can be assembled from these pieces. Now, these kinds of, in a previous life, I spent basically all of my time thinking about how to build complex structures as efficiently as possible. This is sort of an extension of that. But even with these very complex or very sophisticated kinds of methods, there's a little bit of waste. And so the question was, if we were to take those metal pieces and cut them, maybe about 5 to 10% of the metal would be wasted. Was there a way that we could create all that variety and all that complexity and sophistication even more cheaply with essentially zero waste? So the idea was to actually take waste itself, like basically construction garbage, and scan that, classify it, and quilt it in a similar kind of way. So this video shows a little bit the algorithmic process of how that happens. Part of what we do as in our sort of like cultural or art practice is develop these sort of animations or visualizations which allow you to sort of peek under the hood of how algorithms work. So basically what's happening here is that you have this classification system which scans all of those scrap pieces and creates a family tree of that scrap. Once you have that family tree, the family tree also becomes a kind of search engine. You can propose specific kinds of forms, and the algorithm will take all of the scrap pieces that are necessary to assemble those forms and stitch them together. So ultimately what you have is this way of, this method of sort of extreme reuse, where you can take all of those pieces which might not have been reusable before, but can be reclaimed and brought together into a kind of new form. We like to joke that it's a little bit like going to the fridge and finding all of the leftovers and making the best sandwich you could possibly make with those leftovers. That's a little bit this idea. So these are some of the models that come out of that process. Basically, we went to a bunch of wood shops, scavenged up a bunch of scraps, and then scanned those and used that as the basis for these kinds of structures. Now, of course, as architects, we're interested in buildings and how we might apply this kind of process to buildings. And so one of the ways that we've been thinking about this is by actually taking disused buildings, taking them apart, scanning all of those pieces, and then feeding those into our sort of process. So this is a long story, but we have a friend of a friend who owns a nudist colony in Germany, and there are a lot of sort of like old buildings on that nudist colony. He said, okay guys, why don't you take a few of these and apply your process? So we did that. We took a couple of these buildings, disassembled all the pieces, scanned all of them, classified them by color, texture, structural quality, all these kinds of things. and then essentially fed them into a modified version of that process, of that tool. Now, in the previous example, the shapes were a little bit irregular. Here you have more regular shapes, but there are still some geometric constraints on how those pieces can come together. So we had this, we call this process cloud fill, which is a little bit a play on this idea of landfill. Instead of throwing this stuff into the earth directly, we're creating this cloud-based understanding of how you might reclaim and reassemble those things into new kinds of structures. So in a second, it's a little bit related to some of the flocking behavior that Brian was mentioning. In a second, you'll see these actually assemble into a new object. So we're in the process of actually building one of these structures. So sorry, each one of these. So since you're using these very long planks, the ways that you stitch together those planks are a little bit. There's some strong rules about how you can do that, and those rules actually define a certain set of forms which. Classically in architecture, these are called like vaults. So if you think about Gothic churches, Romanesque churches, you have these vaults which intersect to create roofs. In fact, if you're taking those long strips, those determine a certain set of vaulting structures. And so this is essentially the space of possible options you might have for recombining those pieces. So we're in the middle of assembling sort of like a full-scale version of one of those, essentially a kind of sort of cottage of the future, I guess you might say, for this German Museum of the Future, Futurium, which should be super exciting. So the pieces that I've shown so far are really about taking some existing sort of disused or potentially reusable material, scanning it, classifying it, making this family tree, and then thinking about the kind of architecture that can come from that. But there's another way that you can think about reusing the past. Really, that's a certain way of reusing the past. Another way that you can think about reusing the past is to say, look, if we think about the cities of the world, and we think, for the first time in history, if you think about Google Street View, for example, every one of those buildings is scanned, right? Every one of those buildings is sorted in this digital inventory. How can we use that inventory to dream about sort of the cities of the future? So if we were to take those cities and develop, for example, neural networks that could look at those cities, learn the lessons of those cities, and then imagine new kinds of cities, what would that look like? And that was a little bit this project, Horizons. So the idea with Horizons sort of took a little bit of inspiration from this sort of pre-Google Street View book by an artist by the name of Ed Ruscha. He developed this book called Every Building on the Sunset Strip. So if any of you are familiar with Los Angeles, Sunset Strip is this very sort of, I don't know if it's an important street, but it's like for nightlife, I guess it's an important street. It's like a prominent street in LA. And Ed Ruscha basically set up this two cameras on either side of a truck and drove down the full length of that street, and then basically unrolled that film linearly. So you have this super, super long kind of like street view of that particular street. We were interested in what something like that might look like if a neural net trained computer dreamed a new kind of city. So we created this kind of long installation that is exactly that kind of exploration. And the idea was these are a couple of images of the actual installations. I'll mention this in more detail in a second, but essentially we took a series of sort of well-known historical cities. So we took Paris, Amsterdam, Hong Kong. We took Cappadocia, which is not really a city, but has some pretty interesting sort of like dwelling units. And we trained a bunch of different neural nets on these various cities. And then we imagined certain constraints about how these buildings would have to be constructed. Okay? So they have to have obviously a roof and certain kinds of structure, and they have to have windows and certain kinds of patterns. And we developed those kinds of constraints as this sort of second tier. And then we allowed the neural net to sort of do their thing. If you're familiar with this, like Google Deep Dream, you might have heard some or seen some things about this where they teach neural nets to dream art. This is a little bit like that for architecture, basically. And then the bottom 2 rows are ways of sort of recording and inventorying those various combinations so that they can be compared and mapped. So these are examples of the images that are used to train these neural nets. So we took, hundreds of kind of facades from these various places and then categorized all of the specific elements. And that allowed the neural nets to dream in a way which was also very specific, right? So when they think about a building facade, it's not just this amorphous thing, it's actually something that has very particular structural elements. It has windows, it has doors, all the things that a normal building facade would have. And these are some of the buildings that the neural nets began to dream. I have actually, so one of my favorite so essentially we were creating these bots that were making buildings, and one of my favorite bots was the one that was trained on these frame houses, because they're very abstract and very sort of elemental, but they created these graphic structures which are almost like charcoal. Mm-hmm. So they're almost like these sort of like very textural drawings.
And
we're almost done?
we're almost done. Maybe we can leave do you have a video of the?
Yeah, I have that.
And we can leave that going while we start talking.
Okay.
About that.
Yeah. So I guess, so this is a little bit of a flavor of what those bots were ultimately creating. So anyway, should I?
Yes.
I guess that's it.
So we'll leave this moving behind us.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. All right. I don't mean to be really in the middle, but I am. So anyway, thank you both for just such interesting work and visually overlapping in such an interesting way. So I'm going to throw out some questions to them, and you are just totally welcome to jump in at any time. Let's see. I think you both described to us how you solve problems, but maybe just more elaborate a little bit on how the problems present themselves to you. Anybody, or either. So, like for example, for this, were you interested in this project because someone hired you to do it, or is this coming from your own, like, we just want to sort of look at this?
Yeah.
And then people will say, oh, well, we'll hire you to build us a building made out of scraps. Or, yeah.
So it's one of the things that I enjoy about having an office which has some like a commercial dimension in addition to sort of like an art practice is this idea that you do have clients coming to you and saying, well, we need to solve this problem. How can we go about doing that? And sometimes when you're sort of like kind of burrowing into the details of how that's done pragmatically, you realize that can be applied in some other contexts. And so, ultimately this Mind the Scrap project partially grew out of some stuff that we were doing with real estate scanning. So some developers came to us and they're like, well, we're running out of parcels to develop in New York. Where can we find some interesting parcels? And so part of that was, part of the opportunity there was to think about machine vision in this very pragmatic way. But as you begin to develop a kind of craft around that process, there are really interesting ways in which that can be applied in other contexts.
Right. So, and I guess, it's sort of a play on our title of this afternoon, which is how do you create something out of nothing? So in a way, it's how do you create something out of something?
Something entirely different.
Because nothing, there is actually no nothing. It's all kind of generates from like, oh, the frog, or, there's like a something that kind of gets your mind going, and then.
Yeah, for me it's often it's like I just kind of follow my interest and have some faith that something will come out of it. So there's kind of two main ways that I work. One is just trying to take in a lot of input for things that I am interested in, so science or meditation or history, and then trying to find what resonates there for me and dig a little deeper there. So even with tech, like I'm a bit of a geek, but that's not enough. Like if there's something like a virtual reality, let's say, is very hip now in the art world, and there's a lot of coolness around virtual reality, but that's not enough to make an art piece. So what is it that intrigues me about that, and how can I dig a little bit deeper? And the other way is that I often get commissions, and I love working that way. So I'll get commissioned to do a piece in a museum, and they'll say, here's this site, or here's a room, or here's some history that we want you to work around. And then I'll spend time researching that, and again, try to find what resonates at a deeper level. So there's a lot of research in my practice, whatever way.
Yeah, yeah. You know what I noticed? I think I mentioned this when we talked together, that one of your videos was so similar to your embryo.
Oh, the embryos?
Yeah, 40,000 embryos that got
iterations.
Generated, and yours also keep generating, right? In a similar way. So
yeah, there's a strong generative aspect, and also I
Yeah,
thought the zebras were very intriguing, because obviously we're like making zebras on with those large metal pieces. So that was this question around sort of like pattern structure. How is that sort of created, interpreted, or sort of transformed? I think is something which is really definitely present in both.
Yeah, definitely.
Could I expand on
yeah,
that?
please.
How do you introduce color into this, into the software or your designs? Because a lot of them I noticed started out as mostly black and white, or just all white in your case. Towards the end, I see colors in your city.
It's for me, I'm not a great colorist, honestly. So and I'm very interested in movement and the change. So actually, my work went from high color to black and white or monochrome. I just find it's one of these things that you just find the more you constrain yourself, often the more creative you can get. And I just found color overwhelming. And in a way, if I just put that to the side and make it monochrome, then I could just focus on how it looks, how it moves, how it behaves. And that became ultimately more important to me. But the earlier pieces that were very, very bright, like the floor pieces, there I was just going for something. I wanted something that looked alien, but also organic. And so I picked, reds and greens in a way, and it just kind of worked out. But I kind of moved away from that a bit. So.
Yeah, color is a tricky thing, and I think, for us, I'm really interested in sort of like the optical qualities of color, like how can you sort of confuse certain colors for other colors, or what happens when you're in very high contrast situations. And I never think of color as sort of like a decorative element. One of the reasons why color sort of reemerged in this context in hopefully a sort of subtle way is that we were looking at the sort of the palettes essentially of those cities, and trying to sort of understand how those palettes could be transformed. And so that became a way to kind of connect them to the original city, but it wasn't something that we necessarily made a selection around and said, okay, well, this would be a nice color. It was something that was kind of intrinsic to the process.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know what I just picked up on, that you had that one slide early on of an Albers drawing, and of course Joseph Albers was renowned for his working with color and helping us understand how colors react to each other. I don't know if you're familiar with a book that was written in like 1950 called Interaction of Color, and that's what he did. He just studied how this green looks different next to the yellow, next to anyway.
It's funny because he has like these two worlds where he goes super deep on the color side and then super deep on the sort of structure side, and never the twain shall meet. And so hopefully we're sort of getting those to talk to each other. But it's color is it's a challenging world.
I have a question.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
How many revisions that you have to go through in order for you to reach the final piece?
That's a great question. That would be the
Are
failure.
these the final pieces? I don't know.
That's really
Still
good.
still working.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's tricky, like particularly with the kind of work we do, you can constantly update them and change them. So at some point you have to say it's done. But and the way that I tend to work is that it's like a body of work which is never quite done. Pieces are coming out of it, and partly those are dictated by shows I have. Like I have to have something for the show, so boom, this is a piece now. But the actual body of work is still continuing.
But for you, Andrew, when you actually are going to realize whatever, something physical, like a building.
Yeah.
So how does the conclusion happen?
I think there is this idea that there's this body of research that's continuous and sort of always being updated. Like, we have a code base for all of our tools, and there's, I don't know, like 300 or 400 different elements of that code base. So that's constantly evolving, and there are certain iterations of that you can sort of trace through time. But ultimately, when we have a specific project, there's a certain efficiency that has to come into play. And so often we'll sort of like take the code base as it exists and then sort of implement certain solutions from that. So it's almost like the code base of research itself that becomes that's iterative, and then the projects are sort of just like not outputs exactly, but they sort of show a certain level of progress at each moment.
I see. Yeah.
I'd agree. Similar with me, I have like a code base that I tend to share amongst all my projects, and that evolves and changes.
Yeah, it's a cool way to think about sort of creative knowledge in a way.
Maybe just another question I'll throw out, which is something that this is sort of coming from my own sort of sensibility, and that, and I feel this, but I have noticed in our many Catalyst conversations, so I've been doing this for about 6 years, that I hear both from artists and scientists that come together to talk to each other, that there is this need or feeling to fix something or to heal something, especially, scientists working on climate change or...
I thought we were going to get very Freudian here.
Yeah, no. No, just actually wanting to the world is very complicated and it's a mess, and and there's an interest in scientists in working with artists to come up with solutions, like the Broad Institute, which studies does genome research. They invite artists into their labs to work with them, and maybe what the Harvard science department did with you. So it's just something, I don't know if I'm asking if that comes up for you at all. I hear a version of that in the conversations we've done.
I think sometimes problems can present certain opportunities, but usually we're not necessarily the best qualified to solve those problems. It's we're adding a certain perspective to the conversation, and the problem is important, but we use that maybe as a catalyst to sort of have a dialogue with other sorts of interests. I mean, to the extent that we can solve a problem, I think that's great, and obviously for our industrial clients we do that. But I think it's one of a number of different things, including sort of fascinations and obsessions and other sorts of preoccupations that feed into a creative project.
Yeah, I thought it's interesting. Mine is not so much. I'll just talk. Maybe this connects. So when I was at the medical school, I found a lot of frustration actually working with the scientists there. Not because as people they were great, but I feel like our culture puts a lot of emphasis on solving these problems with the scientific method, and there's not as much emphasis in things like connection, compassion, which I think is more what I'm interested in. And you just look at funding models. I struggle for $5,000, and they pay $50,000 to get a little device that goes like this at an exact speed. And it's I don't begrudge them, but there's a little bit of our value system is really unbalanced. So. And I also think that there's a movement in the art world, and I'm not sure if you guys know this, but to try to find a way for art to solve problems like climate change. And I don't think that's actually, I don't really like that. Because I feel like as an artist, I should be able to make a piece that says, the time of humans is over. That's it. And it's okay. Let's accept that. Whether I believe that or not, that's a valid piece and it's a valid thing to think about. And I think that artists should be pushing at the constraints of our culture rather than trying to particularly solve problems of our culture. And as soon as you start phrasing art as something in the service of something, it loses a little bit of poetry that actually makes it powerful. That's how I feel. So I don't think that I feel like art is very powerful and can heal people and open your minds and all kinds of things, but I think when it starts becoming a tool for things that we think are, like climate change, it can sometimes lose a little bit of its power and become more of a didactic.
It's
not very popular.
No, I mean I also notice in just in the world that artists, and maybe it's just their effort or frustration to I also see this problem, whatever it is, and I want to make a dance about X, and so, and sometimes seeing a theater piece or a movie, a piece of dance that is addressing an issue is a way for a person to say oh you might be able to communicate it better in that way.
No, absolutely.
Or, yeah, so.
And I
it's
think
a big,
also-
it's an open, you know.
And in terms, I just think in terms of like our values, I think the stuff that you guys are doing here and engineers in general are just, it's accelerating so quickly that people are not quite sure what to do with it. And having artists in the mix, I think, is quite important. Not just artists, therapists, right? You know, everybody, just to try to understand what's going on and help process it and try to direct where we're going. You know, you look at what's happening with artificial intelligence, it's like quite amazing and quite frightening. I'm not sure how artists can help, but at least maybe we can process it a little bit and try to direct it in a certain direction. That's it, you know, so it's not just engineers.
I actually have a question for the room because there are engineers in the room. Is there anything that you identified with in some of the slides in the process? Very much. And if so, can you say what?
Sure, I particularly like the disassembling the building and digitizing it. And I'm just curious if that came more from a creative thing or of a geek thing.
Yeah. So,
Well,
well,
most of
both.
the-
Oh,
most of
those
the
are
artists-
together.
Just most of the artists I know usually have a job and then they have a loft and they do things there. And
Yeah.
Lowell has a huge art center.
Yeah. So, so that project, I mean, one of the things we've definitely learned over the last several years is that people don't believe that something's possible until you show them that it's possible. And so you can talk all day and say, okay, well, yeah, we think that this could be amazing. Why don't we do this project together? Or why don't you sort of like fund this project or something like that? But it doesn't work until you have kind of like a prototype. And, you know, that, you know, before this, we did some stuff in sort of like the technology startup space, and that was definitely like, you know, really you don't get funding until you have a prototype. And so one of the things that we were, you know, obviously super interested in was this sort of assembly from scraps process, and we had done some more kind of like conceptual prototypes, which were the first ones that I showed. And, you know, we were getting interest. We had, you know, we were talking with a sort of like, with a very well-known footwear company that's like, oh, this would be great for sort of our offcuts, and we were talking with several sort of building products manufacturers. But still there was this challenge in sort of getting people to understand really what this would look like. And so with this, we had some funding partially from this museum, basically, that was substantial enough that we could build something that was basically like a tech prototype. And so that's exactly what that was. And so since then, we actually have a new industrial partnership with this sort of big concrete company that wants to think about this for concrete. And so it's good. And so we always think about this process of prototyping as a way of making certain ideas tangible, and sometimes tangible and sort of like communicable. Like if I didn't have those animations and I were just describing it, maybe people would have gotten it, but probably not. And so, you know, we think of some of the cultural work as making those ideas tangible enough that we can take them to the next level. And so we see it very much as this sort of virtuous cycle, I guess.
Any other thoughts? Yes.
Do you think your art works without movement? Do you see that it would be?
Can you repeat the question or say it
Oh,
louder?
yeah, she's asking whether whether my art works without movement. Yeah, I mean, I do some pieces that are static. That's what you mean, or do you mean the pieces that move? Do you think they move if they're not moving? They work a bit.
No, I'm asking if your art can stand alone as a non-moving piece of art.
Some of it, but a lot of it is designed. Like the stuff you see, a lot of it is designed to move and be dynamic. That's an important part of it. I mean, I could, like the ones that are moving, I could freeze those and print them out. But I don't think that would be enough. I'd have to push that in some level. But there are some pieces I make that are static, like the frog prints and the 3D printed objects. But those moving pieces are designed around being moving. And one of the things that people often, like the floor pieces, people will say, "Can you put it on a wall?" I'm like, well, I could technically do that, but it's a different piece then. You know, and if I were to do that, then I would want to spend some time understanding what does that mean to put that piece on the wall. If I just put it on the wall, then it kind of loses something because it was designed to be on the floor. Or people say, oh, can you make it a different color? Again, technically I can, but it changes the piece. So I'd want to think about what that means and spend some time trying to figure out what the right color would be. So I think maybe that's similar to what you're asking. Like if I were to make this piece static, what would the point be? Like what does it lose? But what can I gain from that? Right now I'm working on, like a lot of my pieces are very big. I'm working on these small sculptures with my wife, and it's given me a lot of freedom to make smaller pieces. There's something really nice about the whole pieces. But again, I have to think about what does that mean for the piece. It's now more of an individual experience. It's contained. It can stay in a house. What do I want to do with that? So it's very important to me.
Did you have something else to
Oh,
add?
no, no, thank you.
Yes.
I have another one. This is more, I guess, a comment than a question, but when we design based on our products, we have to depend upon, we design for symmetry, which stifles creativity like you can't believe. And I was wondering how we could probably try to get out of that, or how symmetry affects your designs. I mean, I saw a little bit in yours in the columns of your panels. They kind of look the same, but there's
Repetition.
nothing in the, a repetition.
Repetition's great for art, and it makes a statement. But for me, I think constraints really make me work better. Actually, they really do. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about, but for me, when I have just an open space, it's overwhelming. That's why I love commissions, because someone comes to me and says, "We have this space, make something for it," and then my brain can say, "What can I do? What would fit here?"
But are you asking, just to clarify, that what you produce must be symmetrical for it to
function,
to
to
work,
work.
right? So I guess
Well,
you're
the
tied
main
to
part
that
of it,
symmetry. I
I
mean,
mean,
maybe it's.
The structure that the symmetrical part goes into doesn't have to be symmetrical.
I see. Yeah.
And that's where you can start to deviate
Yeah, maybe
from
you could
the
figure out-
symmetrical requirements of the design.
But that symmetry can be broken into pieces.
Yes.
You get a symmetric piece here, something that may have maybe not asymmetric that feeds into it. And you may have different symmetries within a circuit, for example.
Yeah, it's funny.
Symmetry is very interesting. I think symmetry is fascinating. And the way it occurs in nature and the way that nature breaks it.
Yeah,
In
absolutely.
those
Yeah.
cases where you see it or don't.
Yeah, it's interesting because we, in some, I guess you can't, it's a little bit difficult to see, but some of these guys, for example, the layouts of the facades were actually, we adopted certain sort of techniques from microprocessor layout design and sort of applied those to the scale of the building. And so there are certain things there which are intended to be sort of like partially symmetric, but deviate in certain other ways. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to sort of, we wouldn't be able to propose a sort of like general solution, but I think one of the things that's interesting about symmetry is this process of sort of intensifying it or putting it in conversation with something that's highly asymmetrical, and then that becomes really interesting.
Isn't it true that human beings prefer symmetry because we are more or less symmetrical?
Some of us
Maybe, yeah.
Some of us do. I mean, not everybody, but engineers do, right? Because, or architects, right? If it's like not perfectly symmetrical, it will collapse or whatever. Yeah.
In organism, symmetry is generally a symbol of health. Some sort of asymmetric, either deformity or disability, would indicate poor breeding process.
Right. Yeah, and you're dependent on the product being consistent so that you stay in business. I mean, that's like a whole other discussion, but sort of related to that, to symmetry.
Repeatability.
Yeah.
So just
Yeah.
a comment, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concept of Pasteur's quadrant in science. So it's a scale of pure research and understanding and then utility. And Edison tried things out. He had absolutely no idea why things were working. He just, let's try this one, let's try this one, let's try this one. No idea how they're working, it's just purely utility. And pure science, like Niels Bohr, solid state physics, at that time was just trying to understand, trying to quantify without any utility. Pasteur had this concept of understanding with utility. And a large part of our commissions, if you use that term, really the customer has a specific utility in mind. Or we understand that, well, they're going to want this utility space. So it's really a constraint on that utility. So it's sort of, the commission is incredibly constrained. And also thinking about one of the, as an engineer, we are taught synthesis as the reverse of analysis. So we're taught analysis first. In other words, here is a circuit that works.
Right.
Take it apart. Okay, now create one. So the natural impulse is to sort of recreate the turkey you just carved up.
It's super interesting, and I think actually, one of the things that we found, at least with the industrial clients that have sort of very strict performance requirements for the kinds of things that we're doing, is that the sort of creative opportunity is in the sort of intensity and sort of representation of how those processes play out. So, we did this project for Audi, for example, where they're trying to understand what the financial impacts of self-driving cars would be on sort of the residential housing industry, right? And so, there's a bunch of different ways that you could represent that. You could represent it as sort of like a series of charts and numbers, but we decided to create this sort of like geographic heat map and then show the process of that transformation in real estate values. So I think there's a lot of really, we're obviously sort of like interested in this idea of data visualization, and I think there's just amazing creative potential in that space, especially when you have these super constrained performance requirements. But I love this idea of the Pasteurs quadrant. That's super helpful.
I think we have time for one more question. I want to just be mindful of the time. If anyone has any question or comment. Yes?
One thing that amazed me about both of your talks is the high degree of code you need to avail yourselves of in what you're producing. So my question is, are you limited by the fastness, the speed of today's computers, or are they adequate for what you're trying to do?
For me, I used to be. But nowadays, I'm usually not on the cutting edge. Maybe with hardware I use, but like the processors are fast enough. But the early pieces, what's funny about them is they run kind of in this what I call meditative space. Like they're not. I could make them faster, but at the time I first made them, I couldn't. So now I have to intentionally slow them down, to do more cycles, iterations, or sleeps or whatever in order to get that speed. But when I first wrote this stuff, it was an issue. Now, what's amazing actually is that there's so many more opportunities, particularly with a lot of my work uses projectors or cameras, and just the scale of those and how much smaller they are and cheaper and more powerful has just enabled me to do things that are I couldn't do 5 years ago. So it's been great.
Yeah, I think there's been some amazing advancements that allow, a lot of the things that would have been limitations a few years ago are no longer so much the case. But like for example, with the neural net stuff, training those neural nets takes 12 hours or something like that on a standard computer. So if we wanted to make something that was completely real time using those sorts of things, then that would require 2 orders of magnitude improvement in the hardware that we have. So there are some things that potentially new sort of new sort of creative possibilities that would be opened if there were a huge leap forward. But I think there's a lot of room for exploration with what we have now.
Can I say?
Question on your neural nets, are you using just software for the neural net, or are you using because IBM has released hardware that's about 1,000 nodes.
Yeah. So basically, we're using some software that's also accelerated using CUDA, and so it's. But yeah, I'm sure some purpose-built hardware would be super useful for that. We just need to have a contact with IBM, I guess.
Well, I just want to show you. No, that previous question. These are my current crop of studio projectors. So you can see, these are pretty amazing. They're 100 lumens. It's all wireless. That one's about 450. That's about 5 times better, and that's about twice as small. But you can just see the evolution. It's pretty incredible.
This has been a wonderful hour, and I just want to be mindful of the workday and our speakers' time. So I want to thank everyone for coming and for having us here at MACOM. So thank you.
Thank you.